Hello, and welcome to Left Coast, Wisconsin, a podcast produced by the Crosse Independent. I'm Rachel Van Alstyne, and one of your co-hosts.
Hi, I'm Eric Timmons of the Crosse Independent and co-host of the show. First up today, we have an interview with Ben Prostine about prisons and their impact on rural and urban communities across Wisconsin. Ben writes the Prison Dispatch column for the Crosse Independent and lives in Crawford County.
Hello, everybody. Welcome to another episode of the Left Coast, Wisconsin podcast. My name is Evan Dvorak, and today I am joined by Ben Prostine, who is, among many other talents, he is a writer at the La Crosse Independent. He's a herdsman, he's a poet, and today we're speaking in a really beautiful old barn, actually, on the property where Ben lives. I don't know, maybe a 100-year-old barn?
I'd estimate that. Mm-hmm.
Yeah, and it really makes me think of an anecdote that you brought up, I don't know, in an article for the Independent or a talk you gave about really how the landscape of southwestern Wisconsin has changed over the last 40 years, really, with the change, demographic change in farming, cultural change in farming, and incarceration, and how that has really become an industry in our region. I thought maybe you could start out talking about that.
Yeah, I think that's a great place to start on. If we were to say jump back 50 years, you'd still have, a large number of small and medium-sized dairy farms in this part of Wisconsin. And what we've kind of seen in the last 50, 75 years even is, a continual kind of out-migration from the countryside of, small and medium farmers through various globalized economic processes kind of getting pushed off the landscape. And what we've kind of seen with rural areas is when they get into these kind of economic recessions, there isn't necessarily a recovery. It's almost kind of like a sustained economic recession. And what we've also kind of seen, the sort of urban correspondent to that would be deindustrialization, which has particularly affected southeast Wisconsin, also kind of the Fox Valley, Green Bay area as well. And so we see this kind of interesting connection where you have sort of rural and urban areas both kind of affected by sort of structural economic changes in the last 50 years. And kind of what we've seen is a growing number of prisons in rural areas and that are predominantly housing prisoners that are coming from urban areas, with southeast Wisconsin, so this would be Kenosha, Racine, Milwaukee, certainly contributing the most number of prisons to these facilities. And then these facilities are situated, they're placed, they've been built in rural areas. And so in one way, this is, a crisis of incarceration, but yet the way it often gets presented in rural areas is that it's economically beneficial, because you think about how much capital and investment goes into building a prison, and then it creates a huge number of jobs. And so in Wisconsin, in the last 25 years, southwest Wisconsin, we've had 4 prisons built or established. And if I remember right, for 2019, the combined expenditures of those facilities, it was over $100 million, and they were, I think, hiring over 1,000 people. And so in one way, this kind of crisis of incarceration, which the burden is being, experienced in urban areas, particularly by people of color, and yet it's kind of fulfilling these sort of jobs and economics benefits is how it's presented in rural areas.
Yeah, and that's, really applicable to just where you and I are sitting right now. We're in Crawford County. I live up in Vernon County, which is right to the north of here. And you and I wrote an article on this very phenomenon in the Vernon County Jail, right? Maybe, and y'all can check out the Independent to read that story in full, but maybe you could bring up how the Vernon County Jail is really, a microcosm of something that we see happening at the statewide level.
Yeah. So, the example I was talking about previously, I was, referring to state prisons. So prisons, built and maintained by the state of Wisconsin, the Department of Corrections. But yeah, that article we collaborated on, we were looking at this more kind of, that sort of microcosm of incarceration with the county jail, where Vernon County was kind of in this situation where they either had to close down their jail about 20 years ago due to just not being up to code, being a very old facility, and then contracting their incarceration needs with other facilities, or taking the other route towards expansion. And so they did choose expansion, building a jail beyond their projected, or I should say their present, demands at that point in time, at the late 1990s, early 2000s, and sort of anticipating I guess, expanding incarceration needs into the future for the county. But that actually didn't happen. And so now they're in a situation where really they're predominantly serving the needs of the DOC, because the DOC is in a situation where their facilities are overcrowded. And so the DOC has started these kind of contract relationships with various county jails. So what Vernon County is doing is they're predominantly housing prisoners from the DOC system rather than, prisoners from Vernon County. And as when we were researching that article, we came upon multiple statements by the sheriff emphasizing how this was a good, quote, good source of revenue for the county. And yet when we kind of looked at the budgets, kind of looked at the hard numbers, really what we're seeing is, it just sort of offsets the incredibly high costs that come with running a facility like this. And if I remember right, the public safety is a quarter of expenses in Vernon County, and
something like that.
And the jail might be 10%, and yet it's not bringing in quote unquote profits. It's really just it's kind of a jobs program for the county.
Yeah, and that's the thing. A few dozen jobs, mostly as guards for the jail. But the problem is that the county is on the hook for all the the overhead of the facility, which is substantial. It's a huge building. Paying the health care of the inmates, which is also substantial amount of money, and paying for food and board. And I think in the contract they're getting like $52 a day from the state to house these folks. And it'd be one thing to say okay, this is a jobs program, we're bringing in these good jobs to Vernon County, but that might not be the case if you look hard. If you really squint at the budget, that's not the case. But there's also kind of the moral side of that too. Yes. Is like okay, it's a jobs program, but are these the kind of jobs that the people of our area really want to support? And I think that's probably not the case. When you and I have talked with community members here, I would say the vast majority of people have no idea that this is even happening in our community. Like when I've mentioned to people, do you know that we're a prison community? That Viroqua, Wisconsin is a prison community. People look at you like, a deer caught in the headlights. We have this image of, of Viroqua and this area being this very quaint, pastoral, bucolic community. Mm-hmm. But we do have this kind of ugly thing beneath the surface. And it's something that, we need to really reevaluate, I think, as a community and see, is this where our values lie? Do our values lie in incarcerating people? Is that something we want to spend, our moral capital on? But even our physical capital through, the budget, maybe there are better things to spend our money on. If we're going to have a jobs program in the county, there's lots of other things that need to be done.
Yes, absolutely agree with that. And I think especially, our incarcerated populations are very much a kind of invisible population. They're out of sight and out of mind, yet these prisons, these so-called state-of-the-art county jails, they are the kind of new monuments of the landscape. We're not seeing numerous new farms going up. We're seeing, more of these incarceration facilities when we look in the last 25 years. And, I remember when we did a kind of prisoner profile for that article, just looking at who was in that facility in June of 2020, and I believe half of the inmates were coming from Milwaukee County, and our Kenosha or Racine, so predominantly coming out of southeast Wisconsin. So once again, there's that whole connection of, we're housing people from these sort of deindustrialized communities on the other side of the state to somehow put a Band-Aid on the sort of agricultural, structural, economic challenges and changes of the rural landscape. And then I know for me what's a real kind of significant part of this too is when you kind of go deeper into incarceration in Wisconsin, and you start realizing too that in Wisconsin we have a very kind of obsolete probation system that's been on the books for about almost 25 years now, truth in sentencing laws, which is kind of Wisconsin's foray into tough on crime legislation. And it's created this kind of, they no longer refer to it as probation, they call it extended supervision. And, I've talked to former incarcerated people about this, and they emphasize how this really needs to be understood as an additional sentence. That yes, you get your prison sentence, and then once you're out, you have your additional sentence, an additional form of incarceration through extended supervision. It's a very kind of strict system of surveillance, and it's created this phenomenon where people end up going back to jail or prison for not even committing crimes, but technical violations like missing appointments. I talked to one former prisoner who he was on a GPS ankle strap monitoring system, and it was malfunctioning one time, and so the local county sheriff gets this automatic update from the DOC. There's a warrant out for this guy, go arrest him. And so they go pick this guy up. They're driving into the county jail, and then, they get a call from the DOC. Oh, that was an equipment malfunction. You don't need to lock that guy up. And, these aren't just kind of rare occurrences. Crimeless revocations are resulting in, I think in 2018, that was 40% of prison admissions were just crimeless revocations. So, people often going back to jail for not even, a new conviction.
I think the craziest anecdote from your last article was somebody who had paid their child support.
Yes.
and that caused them to have a run-in.
Yeah, that's Ron Schroeder, an organizer with the Incarcerated Workers Organizing Committee, and the details of that story is his probation officer asked him, are you paying child support? And he said, well, I'm not really sure because, I haven't gotten my pay stubs back from my job, and it's supposed to get automatically deducted. So I just can't, tell you right now, I haven't gotten that kind of information. And so then he was put on his warrant for lying to his probation officer. And it's just draconian. I mean, some people really refer to incarceration in Wisconsin, and there's so many other parts in the United States, it's really almost like a humanitarian crisis, just an abuse of human rights.
And I would really, emphasize, I think you used the term warehousing, and that kind of seems like that is what a facility like the one here in Vernon County is acting as a warehouse. We might have this kind of image in our minds of somebody being incarcerated. Maybe they're like working in a wood shop, or they're like, getting some sort of skills for reentry. But when we looked into the facility here in Vernon County, there's no programming there. There's very, very basic. There's I think religious services and maybe a Alcoholics Anonymous program. But there's not education opportunities for folks while they're locked up. And I think that's generally been the case in the system, even at the state level, is we've seen these kind of opportunities being whittled away over the years.
Yeah, absolutely. I think there might be a common perception that someone, within the public, that, someone going to prison are going to be offered some form of, rehabilitation. I mean, I'm always very intrigued by the language that the Wisconsin uses to sort of describe what it's doing. So, for example, it's Department of Corrections, and that these prisons, we don't call them prisons, we call them correctional institutions. And a very interesting development now is that the DOC, they no longer refer to prisoners as inmates, but as, quote, persons in our care. And so that creates, I think, this image that, or at least this is what they're trying to portray, is, they are trying to correct individuals or offer some sort of rehabilitation. But I think when we see how things are actually functioning, when you talk to formerly incarcerated people, you get the impression that really it is this kind of warehousing facility. It's what criminologists and scholars that study this, they refer to it as, incapacitation. You're just kind of removing people from society. And maybe just to circle back here, talking about that question of deindustrialization, where, what happens in a place like Milwaukee when numerous warehouses close down, and there's all of a sudden thousands and thousands of people that literally have nowhere to go. They become, a kind of surplus population. And really what we've seen is, the rise of the prison system. It correlates right along with deindustrialization, where this has become a place that's kind of filled with, the surplus populations of our current economic system. And as some other former incarcerated people put it, there's nothing offered. It's almost like you just can, if you don't have the right mindset, if you're not coming in with a certain support structure within, outside of the prison, you just can atrophy, right? Just sort of, rot away. There's no restoration being offered.
Yeah, and this language that you just brought up, the switching from using the term inmate or prisoner to persons in our care, it does make these institutions sound almost like benevolent, like they're like a hospital or like a clinic kind of medical kind of situation. But that obviously we're in the middle of a huge pandemic, so like how is that translated towards, being an incarcerated person in a pandemic time? Like how are people holding up in prison situations?
What we've seen around all of the country, and Wisconsin is no exception, that some of the worst outbreaks of COVID-19 have been in prisons, along with nursing homes and slaughterhouses. These are some of the locations of some of the worst outbreaks in the country. And in Wisconsin, there's been now reported almost 10,000 cases, was the last DOC report I saw. And there is reasons to believe that's not all the cases. And also the DOC has reported 19 deaths, and there's also some kind of muddled information there. The DOC wasn't releasing that information for a while, but so far they have told us that 19 prisoners have died because of COVID-19. And this has really exploded, especially in the fall. So we kind of saw how the pandemic really started moving into rural areas in the Middle West this fall. And as we were talking about earlier, most of the prisons in Wisconsin are located in rural areas. So we've seen just incredibly rapid, prairie fire outbreaks in some of these facilities. So we're in Crawford County talking right now. And so the prison in Crawford County is located in Prairie du Chien. And within less than a month, 80% of the prisoners there were infected with COVID-19. In less than a month, they went from 0 cases to, over 300, I think over 400 people in a 500-person facility got infected with COVID-19. And needless to say, it's a crisis at the very least. It's a catastrophe. It really calls in some serious questions of why aren't we changing this system?
Yeah, and I imagine proper pandemic hygiene is next to impossible. In a prison situation, social distancing, I can't imagine. Have you heard specifically what's happening in some of the facilities in our area?
Yeah, so the DOC provides, sanitizer, they provide face masks. But the one thing that the DOC really can't provide is physical distancing, especially when we consider how overcrowded some of these facilities are. So I was talking about Prairie du Chien a little bit previously, and if I remember right, Prairie has a capacity of around 400, and they're currently have 500 prisoners. If you look at the DOC as a whole, there's about 20,000 prisoners, which is down from 23,000 at the beginning of the year, but still the capacity of the DOC is something like 17 to 18,000. So overall, that's quite over capacity. These facilities are very overcrowded, and it just makes these outbreaks really inevitable when we start to think about it. And we've also, I am in communication with the Incarcerated Workers Organizing Committee, who they work directly with prisoners to kind of support, organizing within prisons and kind of create these networks between prisoners and those on the outside. And they've been receiving reports, going back to the summer that, and this is across the state, including Prairie du Chien, that guards weren't wearing masks. And we saw these reports happening in August. We continued seeing these reports into September and October. And the prisoners keep saying this across the state that, how is COVID coming into these facilities? Well, we're all trapped here. The guards are one of the key ways that the virus gets transmitted into these facilities. And yes, it's true that not all guards and not all facilities are necessarily, it's not like it's total in the fact that all the guards aren't wearing masks, but it only takes a few and the virus, just plummets through the facility.
You mentioned there have been, reductions in the prison population in Wisconsin, but the system is still at overcapacity. You recently wrote an article for the Independent talking about a listening session, a public listening session you attended virtually with Governor Evers and a bunch of other organizations. And obviously some ideas are floating around for what Evers could do at the state level to start dealing with this really public health emergency. Could you expand on that?
Yeah, so at the beginning of the pandemic, back in March, before it really started to spread into the prisons in Wisconsin, numerous organizations in the state were urging Governor Evers to exercise his administrative powers and grant mass commutations, or compassionate release, clemency, which he does have the power to do as governor. And we've seen other states do this. Kentucky, New Mexico are a couple examples, California. And what was getting proposed and what we've kind of seen happen in other states is, releasing people that are within 6 months to a year of completing their sentence. Elderly, health vulnerable prisoners. There's a lot of ways to do this where you could significantly and safely reduce the prison population and deal with those issues of overcrowding, and actually perhaps get to a situation where you could ensure some amount of physical distancing within a facility. And so that was, like I said, those advocacies were happening all the way back in March. Evers and the DOC, they adopted some sort of minimal responses that did account for that drop in the prison population. But as a lot of activists have put it, these are really low-hanging fruits that the Evers and the DOC have reached for. And then we kind of flash forward to the fall, to late summer, where we are starting to see these mass outbreaks in prison after prison. I think I've accounted for 14 prisons had outbreaks of 100 prisoners or more. And so those same advocacies were being voiced once again. They were being voiced again and again at this listening session. But what Evers is talking about is not what he can do as a governor, but talking about what the state can do through the legislators. This is what Evers kept coming back to. He, as I quoted him, he said, he understood the issue of commutations, is what he said to one person who spoke directly to him, but he said it was a small piece of criminal justice reform.
Yeah, and back in 2018 when Governor Evers was running, I mean, I do remember him saying that he supported drastically decreasing the size of the prison population in Wisconsin. I mean, how and why is he not acting on that? I mean, he is the executive of the state. Why is he not acting more forcefully on that?
Yeah, so Evers, when he was on the campaign trail, he accepted the proposals by various organizations to, cut the prison population in half. He supported that as a goal. And so he's been in office, for 2 years now, and really doesn't have much to show for in the pursuit of that goal. And I know many people within the kind of anti-mass incarceration movement, when COVID-19 hit, they thought, well, here is an opportunity for Evers to directly act on criminal justice reform. We know that this system is locking people up for essentially non-offenses, for low offenses related to drugs, etc. We know it's a broken system. It's not offering any kind of restoration. Let's drastically reduce the population and also, ensure the safety of the people that are incarcerated within these facilities. And so that's, here was this great opportunity for Evers to really reduce the prison population, and it hasn't happened. But what Evers was talking about during the listening session was pursuing criminal justice reform through bipartisan legislation, which many people within the kind of anti-mass incarceration movement were really kind of hear this as an excuse. One person I specifically quoted, Shannon Ross, who was a former incarcerated person, he said this is an Evers issue. This legislator is not going to work with him. He's going to have to do something himself. And I think any of us that are sort of observing what's going on in Madison, or really what isn't going on in Madison with the legislator, we know that ever since Evers was elected, there's been this kind of legislative gridlock on all sorts of issues. We have a Republican majority state Senate, state assembly. They've really, in my opinion, continued to kind of practice, Governor Walker's divide and conquer politics. They have no interest in working with Evers. And yet, as we hear from quite a few Democrats on other issues, this call for bipartisan legislation, for, quote, working across the aisle, I rarely hear Republicans saying this. And in a lot of ways, it's kind of just kicking the can down the road when people are dying. People who are in prison are now getting, a death sentence because of COVID-19 because, Evers hasn't exercised the kind of power that he has. And I think what we've also seen in this election cycle is that criminal justice reform, at least to Republicans in Wisconsin, we have seen Republican legislators in other states pursue criminal justice reform that reduces the prison population despite being, part of the grand old party. But in Wisconsin really seems kind of immune to those kinds of actions, even to these sort of fiscal arguments. We've been talking more, I think, about sort of the social and the sort of personal and even moral effects of the system. But it seems that even Wisconsin Republicans are not even moved by sort of the fiscal arguments of just how absurdly expensive this system is. If we jump back to February, the Republican-led legislature did pass some, quote, criminal justice reform that really would have expanded penalties, would have increased the costs of punishment, so to speak. The DOC estimated that if this legislation was put into action, it would entail building 2 more prisons. And we can at least thank Evers for vetoing that legislation. We know if Walker was around, it probably would have gone another way, even though Walker probably would have tried to make sure those new prisons were privatized, I think. But so we just come back to it, I don't foresee bipartisan legislation happening in our current political environment. And at the same time, people are really suffering in these facilities. It really is an opportunity to administratively pursue criminal justice reform.
Maybe you could, it seems strange to me that, Governor Evers, who's the most powerful individual in our state, and he has all these powers at his disposal, and this also seems to be something pretty common in the Democratic Party, that they have all of these tools at their disposal and they refuse to use them. Why isn't Evers drastically commuting people? Why isn't he stepping up and using his executive powers?
I scratch my head with a lot of people that are working, fighting against this unjust prison system in Wisconsin. They're scratching their heads about this. Evers, has voiced, multiple times his support for reducing the prison population, and we're not seeing anything. So I can really only offer some, possibilities of why that is. I think it's important to recognize that the DOC is a massive institution in this state. We're talking about, its budget is exceeding $1 billion in a year. That's more money than the state puts into the UW education system. A correction officer is the most common State Department position in Wisconsin. There are numerous, bureaucracies and administrations within the DOC. It's spread across the entire state. I think there's a status quo, I think, that many people might want to keep going. It is financially beneficial. There's a lot of jobs riding on it. There's a lot of, ways that, the prison system benefits other industries. That's something I think is important to think about, that just keeping that status quo, that business as usual with incarceration. And Evers is going to be up for re-election in 2 years, and we know that Wisconsin is incredibly competitive. It practically tied, in the Biden-Trump 2020 election. And so I know Evers kept saying, he said this during the listening session, that, this doesn't have to do with me getting reelected. We're just trying to talk about criminal justice reform and what we can do about it. But we have to kind of be aware that that is on the horizon, that the Democrats in this state are, through, the kind of gerrymandered situation in the legislature, don't have any power. They really just have power in this administrative realm with Evers. And we know that, I would anticipate that if Evers were to issue mass commutations, we would see Robin Voss and his fellow cronies really weeping on him about that, as they would with any kind of proposal of Evers. I don't think it really matters what he does. They're going to weep on him. And we would see, once again, the kind of dog whistles of tough on crime. We would see Robin Voss and his fellow Republicans going down that road of law and order. This became a real flagship issue for the GOP in the entire country, following the George Floyd revolts, the uprisings in Kenosha. They really go down this law and order gospel, which I think we have to be pretty clear is really appealing to fear, not facts. It's kind of a means to consolidate political power on the right, because when we look at, crime levels in Wisconsin, they're half of what they were 30 years ago. They've been essentially declining steadily for 30 years, and yet incarceration's been going up for all the various reasons we've been talking about for this last half an hour. And so, you kind of wonder if Evers is really just trying to hold on to some re-election hopes. This is another hypothesis. I really don't know why he is not taking action on this, especially when people are dying because of it.
Yeah, and if listeners are hearing this and they're saying, and they're frustrated about the lack of action, at the state level, how can they take action themselves? Like in the latest article you had for the Independent, you listed all kinds of organizations that are active in this realm. Where can people get?
Yeah, Wisconsin has quite a number of groups that are pursuing various forms of addressing this crisis of incarceration in the state. I work and volunteer with the Incarcerated Workers Organizing Committee, IWOC, the Milwaukee chapter. They do a lot of work with, communicating directly with prisoners, hearing what their needs are and, organizing from that standpoint. They also do a lot of work with what they call phone zaps, where when they're alerted of various abuses of power, of various, crises that are happening within facilities. They'll organize a lot of people on the outside to put a lot of phone pressure on that specific prison. And it's gotten things done before. That's one organization that's doing some great work. There's also ex-incarcerated people organizing, which is also connected to Wisdom, which is kind of a faith social justice organization. And they've been holding a daily vigil outside of the governor's mansion to bring attention to this crisis of COVID-19 within the prison population. And on one day they resorted to even blocking the governor's driveway. And so there's quite a few ways. ACLU, American Civil Liberties Union, they have their campaign for smart justice, which has involved everything from petitioning to doing a lot of educational work and putting a lot of policy work together. So, Wisconsin does have a robust set of organizations for people that want to fight this system to get involved more.
Ben Prostine, thanks for joining us today on Left Coast, Wisconsin.
Yeah, thanks for having me. Great talking to you.
Some of you may be familiar with the phrase, "There is no ethical consumption under capitalism," and some of you may not. It has come to mean that we shouldn't beat ourselves up for purchasing what we need to from capitalists in a capitalist system. For example, when you're broke as a joke, grocery shopping at Walmart is what you have to do. It doesn't make you bad for spending your money in a place that makes money off keeping their workers in need of medical assistance and food stamps. Boycotts are useful, but they ignore the economic realities of poor folk and working folk. So, I'm working on a spot for Left Coast, Wisconsin, where I'll be drawing attention to places and companies that are deserving of our ire or our kudos, that should be avoided if possible, or chosen over the other alternatives. We all want to feel good about the places that we spend our money, so we're looking for local, reasonably priced places with good labor relations and customer service. If you have a recommendation for either a soft boycott and or a good alternative, please send them to me. I'd love a quick anecdote too. Give some context for your recommendation and I might just use it on the podcast. And don't worry about how obscure or local the suggestion is either. If you know a locally owned ethical pet food shop, send it. If you know of a coffee shop that on the regular offers free things to homeless folks and allows them to linger to keep warm and dry in the winter, we want to hear about that too. And if you know a place that they treat their workers, the environment, customers, or anyone else like crap, send it and tell us where you shop instead. Send your suggestions and stories to lacrosseindependent@gmail.com and put ethical consumption in the subject line. Thanks!
Hi, I'm Eric Timmons, and this is my mic drop. We hear a lot about the problems facing our farming communities in Wisconsin these days, with so many small dairy farms going out of business. But we don't hear much in the way of solutions to reverse this trend. But there is a way we can rebuild rural communities, and it partly involves going back to the New Deal and the agricultural programs it created. The first thing to understand about US agriculture today is that right now, scarcity is not the problem, but overproduction is. As much as 40% of food produced in the US is wasted, which is difficult to get your head around in a country where as much as 10% of the population is food insecure. The overproduction of food is of course incredibly inefficient for our economy and bad for the environment. For farmers, it means the market is flooded with cheap produce, lowering prices and making it much harder for small farms to survive. But there's a way around this, and it's one we've used successfully in the past. The Wisconsin Farmers Union calls it supply management. Importantly, this is a system that involves planning and collective action. Before the agricultural programs of the New Deal era were dismantled, farmers were paid to set aside some land, taking it out of production. Reserves and cold storage were also used to hold commodities back and maintain good prices for farmers. There also were minimum prices for commodities that factored in the cost of production to build an income floor for farmers. If you've been paying attention to the news coming out of India in recent months, you'll know the farmers there have been engaging in an epic protest against Modi's government and its attempts to remove price supports for farmers and other protections that are actually similar to those contained in the New Deal. In that sense, and others, the struggle of India's farmers is linked to the struggles of our own farmers here in Wisconsin. But back to the New Deal. The programs it launched to balance supply and demand were imperfect, but overall they worked well, creating real prosperity in rural America. But big business didn't like these programs. They'd rather pay farmers less and keep more of the profits. So over time, those businesses, aided by a growing right-wing consensus, worked to roll back New Deal era agricultural policies, culminating in the Freedom to Farm Act, signed into law by President Clinton in the 1990s. The removal of collective planning has resulted in wild swings in commodity prices, ironically making farmers more dependent on government subsidies. Thousands of dairy farms have gone out of business across the country, of course including many right here in Wisconsin. But the Wisconsin Farmers Union has been attempting to fight back, pushing for a reintroduction of a supply management system. The union's experts found that if an updated supply management program had been introduced in the 2014 Farm Bill, it would have kept hundreds of dairy farmers in business by increasing their income and actually saved the government money by reducing the need for subsidies. And the price of a gallon of milk would only have increased by 11 cents for consumers. In conclusion, supply management could help to restore strong rural economies and provide real help to the rapidly vanishing family farm. But it would pose a threat to big business and right-wing ideology. It would show that collective action could work and perhaps serve as an example for other sectors. This is a real solution to the problems in rural America and one we should support. To learn more about supply management, check out the link to the great video on the Wisconsin Farmers Union website. Thank you.
Well, thanks for joining us, folks, for today's episode. We wanted to take a little time right here at this point and explain a little bit about what our vision for Left Coast Wisconsin is and what you can expect from us in the future. We are a social and political issues podcast produced by the Crosse Independent. Myself and Eric and Evan Dvorak, who will be the main contributors to this podcast. We are looking for a lot of community input and a lot of community interaction. So please feel free to send us emails or interact with us on Facebook or Twitter or anywhere else that you can find us. We definitely want to hear what you guys think of the show and get story ideas and that sort of stuff from you. It'd be really, really great for us. So since we have Eric here today, he's the one that approached me about doing this podcast. So I'm just going to put the screws to him for a minute and ask him. So Eric, what was your vision for this podcast particularly? And, where do you hope to see it go in the future?
Well, I hope that this podcast can complement the work we're doing on the Crosse Independent. And I see this as being a sort of a big tent left-wing podcast for Western Wisconsin. And I hope we can kind of give voice to a lot of perspectives that maybe aren't heard in mainstream media. There's not a lot of progressive left-wing media in this part of Wisconsin. And so I hope we can change that. And I know a lot of people are probably starting to reach kind of peak podcast at the moment, right? Because there's so many podcasts out there, but we want this to be a local Wisconsin podcast and to be a campaigning podcast. We want to put ideas out there. We want to be a part of the political process. We want to interview interesting people, and we want to push for change from the left.
That makes sense. I know for me, it's important that the interviews that we do and the content we put out is provocative. And I don't mean provocative in the way that it has come to be understood in modern parlance, but provocative in that it provokes people to think. I think one of the things that's often happens with left theory, left ideology, and leftists in general is we get sort of pigeonholed by mainstream media as to what our values are, what our beliefs are, the things that we're passionate about, and how we feel like we need to interact or advocate for our fellow men and women. And so I think it's important that what we produce here is stuff that people wouldn't, like you said, wouldn't hear in a lot of other places, and also challenges people's perceptions of what the left actually is and who actually belongs to the left and why. I think it's the reason that's so important is there's a lot of common ground, regardless of your self-identification, left or right or center, for working class people in the state of Wisconsin. And that means working class people who punch a clock, work in factories that are either represented by unions or not, and farmers and small business owners or sole proprietorships, people who have are out there struggling every day to make a living in this economic climate. And in the state of Wisconsin, we have a lot of things that are common cause. And I think it's important that leftists in general make an effort to reach across that divide and show people where we're not monsters. We're not, all ready to start up the gulags and put everybody in bad pea green clothing and, create a cultural revolution that eliminates everything except a state line. We're not working towards that kind of future. What we want is equity, which is a word that is often not discussed except in left circles. People tend to replace it with the word equality, which is dubious at best in a meritocratic state, which is what we live in, where equality tends to argue for the quality of access, not actual equity of access, which is a very different thing.
Wow, I knew there was a reason that we decided to have you run this podcast.
I will be the first person to admit that I am still myself very much learning. I grew up in a very labor-oriented family. My father was a union member when he worked at the train company. My mother was a union member when she worked for Jack Winters. My grandparents were both my paternal grandparents were both union members who worked for various companies across Wisconsin, including the old garment factory in La Crosse. And my other side, my mom's side of the family, they were farmers, and my my grandfather was one of the first organizers of the Democratic Party in Jackson County, Wisconsin. So for me, I've been raised in with a certain ideological bent. I'll be the first person to admit it, but I will also suggest that my grandparents would have not been pleased that I'm a self-identified Marxist. This would have been very, very, very controversial. However, the values of what I understand Marxism and socialism to be are in complete alignment with what I was raised to understand about people being empowered to have some kind of control over their future and their economic status, and not to live in fear. And so that's where it comes from, I guess. So you said earlier when you did your little spiel at the beginning of this that you want to see this podcast as a companion to the La Crosse Independent. How so?
Well, I hope we can use this to sort of kind of go deeper into some of the things that we write about on the Independent. Just like today's interview with Ben Prostine kind of feeds off a lot of the work he's done writing about prisons in Wisconsin. And so that's a way that we can kind of complement the writing that we do in the Independent. But also, I hope to do through the Independent that we can do more of what I would call campaigning journalism. And so I hope we can use the podcast as a tool for that as well. And that's things like the way we've written a lot of stories about homelessness in the Independent, and now we're working with our Wisconsin Revolution, the lacrosse chapter, on a petition around that. And that's how I see that journalism can fuel people into taking action. And so I see that this podcast is part of that, trying to kind of raise up ideas that maybe don't get enough attention, and trying to make people think about things and see things from a left-wing perspective.
So do you have a journalistic inspiration? Anybody in particular?
There's all kinds of people. I like Ida B. Wells, was a fantastic kind of citizen journalist. I don't know, so many great figures from left-wing history were also journalists. Marx was a journalist, Rosa Luxemburg was a journalist, James Connolly, the great Irish socialist, was a journalist. So I see, and as the sort of local mainstream media is kind of eroding and kind of falling apart, there's new opportunities are opening up for a different kind of sort of journalism that really kind of is more challenging and holds people to account, and is more adversarial, right? And so I hope we can be part of that here on this podcast.
And something a little more focused on, and originating from hometown. As so much media nowadays, whether it's print media or online or otherwise, is owned, co-opted basically by some kind of corporate entity. We are an independent journalism cooperative, for lack of a better word. We survive on those who are willing to support us via Patreon. And so we'd like to invite any of you who find the content here valuable to them and interesting, that you are interested in fostering an independent media voice in the western section of Wisconsin, we would encourage you to take a look at our Patreon. Eric knows a lot more of the specifics about it, but I just really want to encourage people to do that, to help us out. It would be really useful. There's a lot of things we can do and have already done with the grateful financing of patrons from across the Coulee region.
Yeah, this is definitely a 100% grassroots operation. We're dependent on your support to grow this. We have a budget for the podcast right now, and we need to get some new patrons in there to keep it going. Yeah, check it out, patreon.com/Lacrosse Independent. We have some goodies and freebies on there too that I think you'll like. So please check it out and give us your support.
If you contribute at $7 or more on the Left Coast Wisconsin tier, you will be able to get some pretty cool things. One will be early access to this podcast. Full versions of the interviews. Our earlier interview with Mike McCabe was very long. I actually was able to get it into the full show, but we'd like to not limit our conversations in these interviews. And if we can, we'd like to be able to provide the full context of those interviews to people who are supporting the program via Patreon. We also will have available an opportunity for any contributors to submit questions. We will announce who our interview will be ahead of time so that we can get those questions before the interview. So your questions submitted, if you support us at that level, will be submitted for use in the podcast. We will actually ask the person we're interviewing. It's totally, local. These are, La Crosse County, it's Crawford, right? It's Winona County. I live in Buffalo. We've got people all up and down the river, and hopefully this network of people who are citizen reporters will expand over time, and we will have more people voices that we can add to what we do. But yeah.
If there are people out there who want to write for the Independent, who have ideas for the podcast, please get in touch, lacrosseindependent@gmail.com. And I guess with this podcast as well, we're hoping to expand kind of regionally, not just be focused on lacrosse, and really kind of dig into some of those rural issues, because that's something for the left the left has just gotten slaughtered across rural America. But I think you and I would both agree that there's a lot of fertile ground out there for the kind of ideas that we want to push: Medicare for all, Green New Deal, a revolution in how we do agriculture in this country, and ways that we can get rural towns buzzing again with activity, right?
Yeah. I think that's true. There's a big assumption, and we've all heard it, pundits talking about this since Trump was elected into office, that rural Americans just turned their back on the Democrats. And my argument would be is that the Democratic Party, and to some extent, and maybe more so even, the Republican Party has also, they just say things that people want to hear. I think it's all about making those connections and those policies and those values that we all have that are in common, as I said earlier. And we do believe in equity, and we do believe in stewardship of the land, and we do believe, and that's all of us. That's Wisconsinites used to lead the country in environmentalism. And that's not gone away. The parents, the grandparents that participated in those activities in the 50s, 60s, and 70s are still here. So it's not a dead issue. Those are issues that are still near and dear to Wisconsinites. It's just we have a different view, perhaps, than some, because we want to maintain our hunting, and we want to maintain some other access things that, other folks may not. I think there's room for everybody in that tent. I think that's something that we need to bring a spotlight to. So I'm glad that we did Ben Prostine's interview, because he speaks very eloquently about that relationship between urban situations and problems and their impacts on rural Wisconsin that people don't actually notice or pay attention to. And I think that's really valuable. And I think I'm hopeful that at some point we'll be able to talk about that in terms of immigration as well, because it has a very similar sort of crossover point. You came to me with kind of an ideal, and I think we have a plan to get there. I do ask all of our listeners to be supportive while we stumble and fall and have our occasional missteps, because we will. It's a new experience for Eric, for sure. I've done a couple previous podcasts, but nothing at this level. If people stick around, so listeners, when you stick around, I hope you will find that we have a lot to offer you, and perspectives that you hadn't considered before, or reinforcement for feelings and thoughts that you've had yourself for some time and just not really known how to engage with that. So hopefully you will find some common ground with some of our guests and with us. Hope to see you in 2 weeks. Left Coast Wisconsin is hosted by Anchor and available on the following platforms: Anchor, Spotify, Apple Podcasts, Breaker, Castbox, Google Podcasts, Overcast, Pocket Casts, and Radio Public, with more to come. Please follow the La Crosse Independent on Twitter at La Crosse Indie, and on Facebook at facebook.com/La Crosse Independent. If you like what you're hearing and want to support us and our work, follow us at our Patreon. You can find that at patreon.com/La Crosse Independent, and look for the Left Coast Wisconsin tier. Our theme is Little Hat, written by John Nokavic and performed by Bojo's Mojo, and used by permission of John Nokavic. All other music and sound effects were obtained at zapsplat.com and are used under general licensing Creative Commons.
Audio editing and production, Rachel Van Alstein. Production, copywriting, and talent, Eric Timmons, Evan Dvorak, and Rachel Van Alstein. This has been a La Crosse Independent production, all rights reserved.